Marcus King had never felt more out of place in his life. At just 12 years old, he'd been lucky enough to secure a seat in first class for the very first time. It was supposed to be a privilege, a rare experience that he'd get to brag about for years. But now, as the flight attendants glared at him from the aisle, it felt more like a sentence. He hadn't even gotten comfortable in his plush seat yet. His fingers were still tracing the soft leather armrest when one of the attendants, a woman in her late 30s with an air of superiority, approached him with a tight smile. "Excuse me, sir, but this seat is reserved," she said with a tone that implied she thought he didn't belong. Marcus blinked, confused. "Reserved for who?" The attendant's smile faded as she glanced at the boarding pass in her hand. "For someone else. I'm afraid you'll need to return to your assigned seat in economy." The entire plane seemed to fall silent as a few passengers glanced over, some exchanging quick looks with one another. Marcus felt the heat rise in his chest, but he said nothing, quietly following her as she led him through the narrow aisle. A pit began to form in his stomach. He could hear the murmurs as he passed, and each whisper felt like another weight on his shoulders. As they reached the back of the plane, Marcus felt his stomach drop. He was being kicked out of first class. He looked back toward the front, where the seats of the lucky few who'd managed to secure a spot in that sacred space remained untouched. "I don't understand," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. He wasn't used to feeling small, but right now, in front of everyone, he did. "I'm sorry, sir," the attendant said again, her tone colder now. "We had a mistake when checking your boarding pass. You're in the wrong section." He knew it was a lie, but he couldn't argue with her, especially not now, in front of all these eyes. She had already humiliated him, making him feel like he didn't deserve to be there. She led him to a seat in economy. A cramped, uncomfortable chair that felt like it had been specifically designed to make him feel invisible. As he sat down, he kept his head low, glancing at the other passengers around him. Some of them were too busy with their own business to notice, but a few were still staring, whispering under their breath. He knew exactly what they were thinking. What's a kid like him doing up there in first class? He wanted to scream, to say that it wasn't his fault, that he didn't deserve to be treated like this. But he stayed quiet. His father, Jonathan King, had taught him to keep his head high and his emotions in check. But even his father's wisdom couldn't change the sting of being treated like an outsider. A few minutes later, the announcement came through the plane speakers: "We're about to begin our in-flight service, please sit back, relax, and enjoy your flight." Marcus sank into his seat, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His fingers dug into his skin, grounding him in the moment. "It's just a mistake," he kept telling himself. "Just a mistake. They'll fix it soon enough." But the way the attendant had looked at him, so sure of herself, so certain he didn't belong, made him feel like there was something more going on. He glanced over at the first-class cabin through the thin curtain that separated the two sections of the plane. The rich, leather seats and the wide windows made it seem like a different world, one he couldn't quite touch. He hated it. He hated the feeling of being out of place, of being judged. But more than anything, he hated how small it made him feel. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden tap on his shoulder. Startled, Marcus turned around. It was a man, a tall, middle-aged passenger sitting a few rows back, his face partially obscured by a pair of large, dark sunglasses. He seemed to be watching him closely, not with judgment, but curiosity. "You okay, kid?" the man asked, his voice low but calm. Marcus nodded, his mouth dry. "Yeah, just a mistake, I guess." The man raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that?" Marcus wasn't sure how to respond. He didn't know this man, but the question seemed to cut through the fog of embarrassment that had settled over him. It was like this stranger could see right through the layers of pretense, the polite smiles, the false confidence. It made him uncomfortable. Before he could respond, the man's expression softened, and he leaned in a little closer. "Don't let them get to you. People love to think they're better than someone else. Don't let them define who you are. Marcus wasn't sure how to take that. Was this man saying it wasn't about him? That it wasn't really his fault? Before he could ask, the man stood up and started to walk toward the front of the plane. Marcus watched him go, feeling a sense of disconnection. Who was this guy, and why did he feel like he knew exactly how Marcus was feeling? Marcus sank back into his seat, staring out the window. He couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. It wasn't just about being moved from first class. It was about the look in the attendant's eyes, the way she had assumed he didn't belong, just because of who he was. He didn't even realize he was clenching his fists until his fingers ached. He wanted to tell someone. He wanted to tell his dad, but Marcus knew that Jonathan would handle it in his own way, with the kind of power and authority that only someone with money could wield. But what about Marcus? What about how he felt? Was he supposed to just accept it? Was he supposed to stay silent and let people treat him this way? He stared out the window again, watching the clouds pass by, and tried to push the thoughts aside. But deep down, he knew this wasn't just a mistake. This wasn't just about a seat on a plane. This was about something bigger. Something that was going to change everything. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this moment, this tiny injustice, was the beginning of something far more complicated than he ever imagined. And in the back of his mind, he knew it wasn't just about being moved out of first class. Something was coming. Something he wasn't ready for. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? As the plane hummed steadily through the air, Marcus clung to that question, uncertain of where it would lead, but knowing it had to mean something. Marcus King was not the kind of kid who expected things to come easy. He had learned that lesson early in life, growing up in a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of Atlanta. His family's apartment, though small, was filled with love, and that was enough for Marcus. Still, there were times when he couldn't help but wonder what life would have been like if things had turned out differently. He remembered his childhood vividly, his mother, Carol, a hard-working nurse who had sacrificed so much to provide for him and his younger sister, Ava. She'd always taught him that nothing worth having comes without effort. His father, Jonathan King, on the other hand, had a quieter presence. He wasn't the kind of dad who showed up at every PTA meeting or sports game. But what Jonathan lacked in presence, he made up for in wisdom. He had raised Marcus with a sense of humility, never allowing him to get too comfortable with the luxury that came with his success. Jonathan King was a tech mogul. He had built his empire from the ground up, making billions by creating one of the most influential software companies in the world. But despite his wealth, he'd kept it hidden. He drove modest cars, wore simple clothes, and only spoke about his work when Marcus asked him. The family lived in a home that, while larger than most in their neighborhood, was still modest in comparison to the sprawling mansions of his father's billionaire peers. Marcus never really understood why his dad chose to keep his wealth under wraps. He had heard whispers from classmates who wondered why they couldn't go on extravagant vacations like other kids. They questioned why Marcus' clothes weren't as fancy as those worn by some of his peers. Even at a young age, Marcus had been aware of the difference in how people saw him, and how he felt caught between two worlds, one where his family was anything but ordinary, and another where he tried his best to blend in with the kids who didn't know the truth. At school, Marcus had always been an outsider. He wasn't poor enough to fit in with the kids from the working-class families, but he wasn't rich enough to fit in with the kids whose parents worked in high-paying professions or owned businesses. He knew what it felt like to be in the middle, to be judged for things that weren't always in his control. His friends would often make fun of him for wearing sneakers that weren't the latest brand, or for not having the newest tech gadgets. Marcus learned early on to stay quiet, not to argue. After all, what was the point in trying to explain a situation that no one would truly understand? His mother, Carol, always told him that his worth was not tied to money. "You have everything you need right inside of you," she'd say, running a hand through his curly hair. "You don't need flashy things to prove you're special, Marcus." You just need to be kind, work hard, and never forget where you come from. But despite his mother's comforting words, Marcus couldn't help but wonder why his dad, a man who had built an empire, had chosen to live so quietly. He had heard rumors around school, whispers about Jonathan's wealth, and although Marcus never confirmed them, there was something about the way his father looked at him when they spoke that made him think his dad knew exactly how his life was about to change. Jonathan had always said that Marcus needed to learn about the real world, not the one where money solved everything. But lately, Marcus had started to wonder if his father's silence was more about protecting him from something. Or perhaps it was just Jonathan's way of teaching his son the hardest lesson of all, to live life with humility. There were moments, though, when Marcus could feel the pressure building, the pressure to step up, to be something greater than what the world thought of him. He knew his father expected him to be strong, to carry the legacy of the King family, and to make something of himself. But how could he do that when he didn't even feel like he belonged? In those quiet moments, when his father wasn't around, Marcus would sit in his room and daydream. He imagined a life where he didn't have to worry about whether people saw him as different, where he could be accepted for who he was and not judged for his clothes or his family's wealth, or lack thereof. But today, as he sat alone in that cramped seat in economy class, Marcus was forced to confront his deepest fears about who he was and where he came from. He had always believed that he could rise above it all, that he could make something of himself without the shadow of his father's success hanging over him. But this experience, being humiliated in front of everyone on the plane, made him feel small. It made him question whether he had what it took to carve out his own place in the world. It wasn't just the incident on the plane. It was the way people looked at him, like he didn't belong. Like his seat in first class had been an accident, a mistake. It wasn't just about being moved from one section of the plane to another. It was about how the world viewed him because of his race, his background, and his family's wealth, or the lack of acknowledgement of it. Marcus had always tried to brush off the stares, the whispers, the jokes. He had convinced himself that it didn't matter. But now, as the plane flew higher into the sky, a knot formed in his stomach. He couldn't help but wonder if there was more to this moment than he realized. Maybe it wasn't just an embarrassing mistake. There was something bigger at play, and he was starting to understand it. Marcus wasn't just another kid trying to make it in a world that didn't always make sense. He was the son of one of the wealthiest men in the world, though no one knew it, and that fact was about to change everything. In the silence of the economy cabin, Marcus felt his thoughts swirl. He had always known that his father's empire was something that he could never fully escape. But now, as he sat there, humiliated and confused, he realized that the moment he stepped onto this plane, his life had already shifted. Things were about to change. And Marcus had no idea how to handle it. In the middle of his thoughts, his phone buzzed. It was a message from his father. Jonathan had been keeping an eye on the situation, but Marcus hadn't expected him to intervene, at least not like this. The text was simple: "Don't worry. I'm going to take care of this. Just hang tight. You're stronger than this." Marcus stared at the message for a moment, the weight of his father's words sinking in. For the first time, he felt the full weight of what his father's life had meant, not just for him, but for the world around him. As the flight continued, Marcus let out a deep breath. He didn't know what would come next, but he was ready for whatever it was. Something had shifted. Something big was about to unfold. And Marcus King was going to be at the center of it. As the plane continued its journey, Marcus found himself trapped in a storm of emotions. The discomfort of being kicked out of first class had not subsided. He sat in the cramped seat, staring at the back of the chair in front of him, trying to block out the whispers from the passengers around him. His heart raced. His hands were still tense, clenched into fists. The air felt suffocating, and the normally comforting hum of the plane's engines only added to his mounting anxiety. Why did this happen? He had been in first class for just a few minutes before they moved him. Just a few minutes, why did it feel like a lifetime? The more he thought about it, the angrier he became. It wasn't just about the seat. It wasn't just about being moved. It was about the way the flight attendant had looked at him, like he didn't belong, like he was some kind of mistake. Marcus was used to feeling out of place, but this time, something felt different. He could tell something bigger was going on. Something he couldn't see yet but could feel deep down. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through the text from his father again. "Don't worry. I'm going to take care of this. Just hang tight. You're stronger than this." The message, simple as it was, did little to calm him. Jonathan King was always calm, always in control. But that wasn't enough right now. Marcus needed to understand why this was happening. He didn't want to be the kid who always needed his father's help. He wanted to fight his own battles. And yet, there was something in the way his father spoke, something in the way he always knew exactly what to say, that made Marcus uneasy. It was as though Jonathan already knew how this would play out. He knew what was coming next. The same feeling crept up in Marcus, something was brewing, something that would force him to step into the world his father had kept him away from for so long. Could it be the rumors? The whispers about my dad's business? Before Marcus could dwell on this further, his thoughts were interrupted by the same flight attendant who had escorted him to his seat. She appeared at the front of the aisle, her eyes scanning the cabin, her body stiff, and her face unreadable. This time, though, her approach wasn't about moving him again. Instead, she was looking at him directly, her gaze almost cold. "Marcus King," she said, her voice loud enough for several passengers to hear. "I've been asked to bring you up to the front. You're needed." The words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, Marcus froze. His stomach flipped. What did she mean by, "you're needed"? And who had asked for him? She didn't give him a chance to respond, already stepping back toward the front of the plane. 1,000 questions raced through Marcus's mind as he slowly stood up, trying to calm the sudden rush of nerves flooding his system. He could feel the eyes of the passengers on him again, their gazes following his every move as he made his way up the narrow aisle. By the time he reached the front of the plane, the flight attendant was already gone, leaving Marcus standing there, unsure of what to expect. And then he saw him. Standing in front of the cockpit, a man dressed in a sharp suit with a look of quiet authority was waiting for him. It was a figure Marcus didn't recognize at first. He was tall, with neatly combed dark hair and a serious expression. But the moment their eyes locked, Marcus felt a strange sense of familiarity. The man extended his hand, and Marcus, despite the confusion still swirling in his mind, shook it. "Marcus King," the man said with a slight nod, as if he were already familiar with the story of his life. "I'm Carter Reynolds, the flight operations manager here. It's a pleasure to meet you." Marcus didn't return the smile. His stomach churned, unsure of what kind of situation he was walking into. Nice to meet you," Marcus managed, his voice trailing off. "I'm sure you're wondering what's going on," Carter continued, his voice calm but assertive. "I'm not here to cause any trouble. I'm just trying to make sure everything gets sorted out. You see, there's been a bit of a misunderstanding. A very unusual one, actually." Marcus stood there, silent. He had no idea what Carter was talking about. "You're probably aware that your father is Jonathan King, the founder of King Technologies?" Carter asked, a knowing look in his eyes. Marcus nodded slowly. "Yeah, I know." "Good. Well, there's been some confusion," Carter said, stepping back slightly as if to give Marcus space. "You see, your father has a very significant presence with this airline, and things have gotten a little complicated." Marcus' brow furrowed. "What do you mean, complicated?" Before Carter could respond, Marcus felt a sudden shift in the atmosphere. The flight attendant from earlier reappeared, and this time, she wasn't alone. Standing beside her was another man, an older man, wearing a black suit, with a face that looked like he'd seen it all. His eyes were sharp and calculating. "We need to discuss your seating arrangements," the older man said, cutting through the tension. Marcus was beginning to feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. He glanced between Carter and the older man, confusion swirling in his chest. "What's going on?" Marcus asked, his voice wavering slightly now. The older man exchanged a brief look with Carter before turning back to Marcus. "It's more complicated than you think, kid," the older man replied, his tone flat. "This isn't just about a seat on a plane. This is about your family's influence. There's more at play here than you realize." The words landed like a bomb, and Marcus felt the full weight of them. The reality of the situation was dawning on him, but it was too much too fast. His father's empire wasn't just about technology and wealth, it was tied to more than just the software he built. It was tied to everything. Everything that was about to change. "Your father has some very important relationships with this airline," Carter continued, breaking the silence. "And what happened back there wasn't a mistake. It was a statement." Marcus' stomach twisted into knots. A statement? Before he could ask another question, Carter raised his hand to silence him. "I'm going to need you to stay calm and listen," he said, his voice taking on an edge of urgency. "There's more going on here than just a simple misunderstanding. We need to talk about what happens next." The flight attendants and staff watched, silent, as Marcus tried to absorb the words. What had just been a routine flight had turned into something far more complicated, something that, as he realized now, was only the beginning. As Marcus stood in the front of the plane, with the tension thick in the air, he could feel the moment slipping away from him. His world was shifting, and he didn't know how to hold on. But he was about to find out. The tension in the air was thick as Marcus stood before the men. His mind raced, trying to process everything Carter and the older man had just said. He was still reeling from being kicked out of first class, but now it seemed like the entire situation had escalated into something much larger than he could have imagined. "What's going on?" Marcus asked again, his voice quieter now, but the confusion was still evident. Carter Reynolds looked at the older man beside him, who simply nodded and took a step forward. "You're about to learn something, Marcus," the older man said in a deep voice. "Something about your father and the King family that you've never been told." Marcus's heart began to race. He had always known there were things about his father's life that were kept from him, but the words, "never been told," hit him like a punch to the stomach. What was going on? Why was his father's name being mentioned in the context of this airline? Why was this just now coming to light? "I'm listening," Marcus replied, his voice shaking slightly. The older man, who had yet to introduce himself, glanced back at Carter, who gave a slight nod before turning to Marcus. "It's not just your father's business relationships that tie him to this airline," Carter said, his tone even but laced with a sense of gravity. "Your father is a key shareholder. His influence here is much more significant than we initially let on." Marcus blinked. "What does that mean?" "My dad owns part of this airline." Carter hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "More than that, Marcus. He controls more than just the stock. He has a powerful stake in its direction. And this wasn't just some corporate maneuver. This was a carefully crafted alliance, one that was meant to secure, well, let's just say it was meant to secure certain advantages for your family." Marcus's mind was spinning. This was information he had never heard before. His father had always kept his business dealings private, and Marcus had never once asked about them. But now, everything was coming to a head. He wasn't just the son of a tech mogul. He wasn't just a regular kid from Atlanta with a complicated life. He was part of something much bigger. The older man leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a whisper, as though he was telling Marcus something of great importance. "You don't understand yet, but this airline situation, it's part of a larger web. Your father's not just about making billions. He's a key player in a game that involves not just technology, but politics, power, and even national security." Marcus felt his knees weaken as he tried to process the information. His father, Jonathan King, a man who had always been so humble, so quiet about his wealth, was involved in something that went far beyond what Marcus had imagined. Why are you telling me this now? Marcus asked, his voice thick with disbelief. Why didn't anyone tell me about this before? Carter exchanged another glance with the older man. Because this situation, what happened on this plane, is no accident. Someone wants to send a message. And it's not just about you being moved to economy. It's about sending a warning to your father. Marcus's blood ran cold. A warning? Who would do that? The older man straightened up, his eyes locking onto Marcus's with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. Someone who wants to take your father down. Someone who thinks your family's influence has gone too far. Marcus felt the weight of the words hit him hard. He had always assumed his father's success was just the result of hard work and intelligence. But now, it seemed like there were people who resented that success, people who wanted to tear it all down. What does this have to do with me? Marcus asked, his voice now steadier, though the shock still lingered. Why is this happening to me? The older man sighed, his expression softening just a fraction. You're in the middle of this, Marcus. Whether you like it or not, your father's empire affects everything. And right now, you're being used as a pawn in a much bigger game. Marcus felt his chest tighten. He wanted to argue, to protest, but the reality of the situation hit him like a freight train. He wasn't just an innocent bystander. His family's wealth, his father's secrets, had put him at the center of a dangerous game that he hadn't even known existed. Your father's influence isn't just about money, Marcus, Carter continued, his voice a little more urgent now. It's about power. And right now, there are people trying to undermine that power. They're using this airline, your presence on this flight, as leverage. Marcus tried to steady his breathing, but it was getting harder. He felt overwhelmed. His entire world, what little he had known about his family's life, was shifting beneath his feet. There was more to this than he had ever imagined. What's going to happen now? Marcus asked, barely above a whisper. The older man looked at him gravely. The first thing you need to know is that you're not in control of this situation. But we'll do everything we can to protect you. This is going to escalate, Marcus. It's only the beginning. A long pause followed, and Marcus's mind raced with the implications. His father, Jonathan King, had built an empire in silence. But now, it seemed, the world was learning just how far-reaching his power truly was, and Marcus was stuck in the middle of it. Who are these people? Marcus asked again, his voice rising in frustration. Who wants to take down my dad? Why would they go to such lengths to involve me? Carter's face darkened. I wish I had more answers for you, Marcus. But I'm afraid this is just the tip of the iceberg. You're going to have to trust that your father has been preparing for something like this for a long time. We'll be in touch with him shortly. For now, just keep your head down. As the minutes passed, the weight of everything that had been revealed pressed heavily on Marcus's shoulders. The small incident that had seemed like nothing more than a misunderstanding in the first-class cabin was now a prelude to something far more dangerous. A shift in the air was palpable. Marcus felt it in the pit of his stomach. His life, his whole world, was about to change in ways he couldn't even begin to understand. As he turned to leave the front of the plane, the words of Carter and the older man ringing in his ears, he couldn't help but wonder, how deep did this rabbit hole really go? Marcus paused for a moment, taking in the full weight of the situation. The journey ahead of him wasn't just a physical one. It was a journey into a world that was far more complicated than he had ever realized, a world where power, secrets, and influence ruled, and where nothing was ever as it seemed. And Marcus King was at the center of it all. Marcus sat back down in his cramped seat, the buzzing of the plane's engines no longer offering him any comfort. His mind whirled with everything he had just learned. His thoughts were clouded with confusion and disbelief. His father, Jonathan King, wasn't just a tech mogul. He was involved in something far bigger, a web of corporate power, secrets, and a threat that Marcus couldn't yet understand. His chest felt tight, and his stomach churned as his fingers gripped the armrest. The man who had always been his hero, his mentor, the one who had taught him everything about hard work and resilience, was now a target in a game of corporate power that Marcus hadn't known existed. And now, he was caught in the middle of it. A knock on the side of his seat jolted him out of his thoughts. He turned to see the same flight attendant from earlier, this time with a look of urgency on her face. "Marcus," she said softly. "There's someone who needs to speak with you." His heart skipped a beat. Who else could it be? Was his father already on the phone? Were they moving him somewhere else? Before Marcus could respond, the flight attendant stepped aside to reveal a tall man in a black suit, his expression grim. The man was older than Marcus, perhaps in his late 30s, and carried himself with the kind of quiet authority that made everyone around him feel like they should fall into line. "Marcus King?" the man asked in a low voice, his eyes scanning the cabin quickly. Marcus nodded, still unsure of what was going on. "I'm David Pierce," the man introduced himself. "I've been sent by your father." David's words hit Marcus like a bolt of lightning. His father had sent him. "Sent me?" Marcus repeated, still trying to process everything. "What's going on? Why didn't he just call me?" David's expression softened, just a little, as if he understood Marcus's confusion. "Your father's aware of what's happening. He knows what you're going through, and he's doing everything in his power to keep you safe. But the situation is complicated. We didn't want you to panic, so we kept things from you for as long as possible." "What situation?" Marcus pressed, his voice shaky. "I don't understand. Why is this happening? Who's trying to take down my father?" David looked around cautiously, then took a seat across from Marcus. "The truth is, Marcus, your family has been involved in some high-stakes corporate dealings for years. But there's one enemy your father has been trying to avoid for a long time, an organization that wants to control everything your family has built." Marcus's heart dropped. "An organization? Like a rival corporation?" David shook his head slowly. "No, Marcus. This is much bigger than that. This is about power, real power. There are people with more money, more influence than you can imagine, and they want your family out of the picture." Marcus felt his chest tighten as the words settled in. His mind was swimming with questions. What kind of people could have that much power? And why hadn't his father told him any of this? "Who are they?" Marcus asked, his voice barely a whisper. David paused, his eyes meeting Marcus's with a seriousness that chilled him to the bone. "They're not just businessmen or women. They have connections everywhere, politics, military, intelligence agencies. They've been trying to bring down your father for years, using any means necessary." Marcus's mind raced, trying to grasp the weight of what David was saying. His father had been fighting a shadow war, one he had never even known about. No wonder he had always been so secretive, so cautious about what Marcus learned. "But, why me?" Marcus asked, his voice cracking. "What do they want with me?" David leaned in closer, his voice dropping even lower. "They want your father to step down. They know he's not just a tech mogul. They know he's a major player in an underground network of people who control more than just the economy. And they want him out." Marcus's mind reeled. "But why would they target me? Why involve me in this?" "They know your father's not easy to reach," David said, his eyes hardening. "But you, Marcus, you're vulnerable. They think they can manipulate you, make you turn against him." Marcus felt his stomach churn at the thought. "What do they think I'll do? I don't even know what's going on." David's expression softened, just a little. "They don't care about you, Marcus. They care about the King name. They want to make your father vulnerable, get you to question everything you know about him." Marcus's head was spinning. His world, the one that had felt so solid and certain just hours ago, was collapsing in on itself. His father, the man who had built an empire from nothing, was a target in a war Marcus hadn't even known existed. "You need to be careful," David warned, his voice low but firm. They're watching you, Marcus. Every move you make. And you need to stay close to your father's people. Stay with us. Marcus nodded slowly, his mind reeling. He had always thought of his life as something separate from his father's world. But now, that world had collided with his own in ways he couldn't have imagined. I'll do whatever it takes to protect him, Marcus said, the words feeling more like a promise than a declaration. He had never felt this protective before, not even when he was a kid. But something inside him had shifted. He wasn't just Jonathan King's son anymore. He was part of something far bigger, and he wasn't about to let anyone tear it down. David studied Marcus for a long moment, then stood up, offering a hand. We need to get you off this plane. It's no longer safe for you here. Marcus took the man's hand, his own grip strong with resolve. What happens now? He asked. David's eyes narrowed. Now we fight. And it's going to get a lot harder before it gets better. As Marcus stood to follow David toward the back of the plane, he couldn't shake the weight of what had just been revealed. His father's empire was under siege, and he was right in the center of it. But for the first time, Marcus understood what it meant to truly fight for everything you love. The plane seemed to tremble slightly as it cut through the air, but Marcus barely noticed. His world had shifted forever, and there was no turning back. The journey ahead would be dangerous, but Marcus was no longer the boy who had just been kicked out of first class. He was about to enter a battle for his family's survival, one that would take everything he had to win. And this was only the beginning. The cold air hit Marcus as he stepped out of the plane and onto the tarmac, his heart pounding in his chest. David led him toward a sleek black car parked under the shadow of a hangar. The sound of the plane's engines fading behind them only amplified the weight of the situation. Marcus could feel the eyes of those around him, the hidden forces tracking every movement he made. He wasn't just on a plane anymore, he was in the midst of something far bigger than he could have ever imagined. Inside the car, the windows were tinted black, the interior quiet, almost suffocating. David didn't say a word as the car sped away from the runway and toward a private facility, leaving the airport behind. Marcus turned to face David, who had been unusually silent since they left the plane. Why didn't you tell me everything earlier? Marcus couldn't hold back any longer. The urgency in his voice mirrored the anxiety that had been building inside him ever since he learned the truth about his father's empire. Why was I kept in the dark about all this? I don't understand. It feels like I'm being dragged into something I'm not ready for. David exhaled, glancing out the window. You weren't ready. And it wasn't just my choice to withhold this information, Marcus. Your father has always been cautious, careful about when to tell you certain things. This situation, it's dangerous. If you knew everything, you could have been used against him. Marcus leaned back in the seat, the weight of David's words sinking in. The quiet comfort of his life was slipping through his fingers, replaced by something far darker. He had always known his father was powerful, but this was something else entirely. And it wasn't just the tech world they had to worry about, it was much, much more. So, what happens now? Marcus asked, his voice barely a whisper. What am I supposed to do with all this? How do I even begin to fight back? David finally turned to face him, his gaze sharp and intent. Right now, you're going to learn everything you need to know. No more hiding. No more pretending that everything's normal. You need to understand what's really at stake here. The car made a sharp turn onto a private road, winding its way up a hill. The trees around them seemed to close in, creating an eerie atmosphere that made Marcus feel like they were being watched from every angle. His anxiety began to rise again, but he fought to keep his emotions in check. As the car pulled into a hidden estate, Marcus felt the weight of the situation settle deeper into his bones. This was no ordinary place. It looked like something out of a spy thriller, high-tech security systems, armed guards standing by, and the overall sense that this was a place where secrets were kept, and lives could be lost without question. Welcome to the compound, David said, his voice colder than before. This is where you'll be staying for the time being. Until we figure out what's next, we can't risk you being anywhere else. Marcus was about to ask another question when David's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced down at the screen, then glanced back at Marcus with a stern expression. You need to stay here. No one can know where you are right now. Trust me, it's for your safety. David stepped out of the car and disappeared into the building, leaving Marcus standing in front of the imposing structure, trying to process everything. The compound was like a fortress, with high walls surrounding it and security cameras everywhere. Marcus had never been to a place like this before, and the isolation of it sent a chill through his veins. The world he knew, the world he thought was solid and secure, was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous. He followed David inside, where he was met by several more people, more of his father's associates, Marcus assumed, all of whom eyed him warily as though waiting for him to crack under the pressure. A few of them looked familiar, but none of them offered any comfort. Everything you need is here, David said, motioning toward a large room in the back. You'll be briefed on everything soon. But for now, take some time to settle in. You'll need your strength. Marcus barely heard David. He felt like a pawn in a game he didn't understand, surrounded by people who had no interest in explaining what was really happening. The walls seemed to close in, and the weight of his new reality felt heavier with each passing moment. His father's empire was under attack, and Marcus was expected to somehow protect it, though he still didn't fully comprehend the forces working against them. As the door closed behind him, Marcus stood in the center of the room, taking in the minimalist design of his temporary quarters. It was like something out of a high-end hotel, sleek, modern, and impersonal. His mind was racing. What am I supposed to do now? He had always considered himself to be someone who could handle anything. After all, he had grown up with immense privilege. He had been shielded from the darker side of his father's business dealings. He had never questioned the power that came with his family's name. But now, that very power had become a weapon, and Marcus was at the center of it all. The knock on the door broke him from his thoughts. He opened it to find David standing there, a folder in his hands. We need to talk, David said gravely, stepping into the room without waiting for an invitation. Things are about to get complicated, Marcus. The people who are after your father, they don't play by the rules. And if we don't act quickly, they'll take everything from us. Marcus felt a rush of anger. What are we waiting for? Why hasn't my father done anything to stop this already? David looked at him with a weary expression. It's not that simple. Your father has been trying to protect you, trying to keep you safe, but he can't do this alone anymore. He needs you, Marcus. You need to step up. You have to be part of this now. Marcus clenched his fists. For the first time, he felt a fire burn within him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. The reality of the situation was setting in. This wasn't just about wealth, about family. It was about survival. And Marcus was ready to do whatever it took to protect the one thing that truly mattered. My father has always taught me to fight for what matters, Marcus said, his voice steady, his gaze unwavering. I'm not going to back down. David handed him the folder, his expression softening slightly. Good. Because this game is just beginning. And it's going to get worse before it gets better. Marcus opened the folder and scanned the contents. What he saw shocked him. Inside were plans, intelligence reports, and names of people who were at the heart of the conspiracy against his father. But there was something even more chilling, names of people Marcus had once considered allies. He looked up at David, the weight of everything now fully on his shoulders. Who can I trust? David paused, his eyes hard. Trust no one outside of this room, Marcus. The enemy has eyes everywhere. This battle is about more than just business. It's about power, and they'll do whatever it takes to bring us down. The door slammed shut behind him as he began to prepare for the fight of his life. Marcus King wasn't just playing a game anymore. He was in the middle of a war, and no one, not even him, knew where the end was. The next few days passed in a blur of secrecy and strategy. Marcus had been thrown into the deep end, forced to learn quickly about the dark forces plotting against his family's empire. Every hour seemed to bring new revelations, new dangers lurking in the shadows. But as overwhelming as it was, Marcus couldn't deny that something within him had shifted. He wasn't just the son of a billionaire anymore. He was now an active player in a game that had far higher stakes than he ever imagined. David Pierce had become his guide, showing him how to navigate the treacherous waters of power and influence. He wasn't the only one helping Marcus, though. There were others, people who worked for Jonathan King, people who had been part of the family's empire for years. But no one, it seemed, was beyond suspicion. "Marcus, you need to understand something," David said one morning as he led him through a secure hallway in the compound. "There are two kinds of people in this world, those who work for power, and those who wield it. Your father has spent his whole life fighting to make sure we are the ones who wield it. But there are others, Marcus. They don't just want to destroy him, they want to rewrite the rules. And if they succeed, we'll lose everything." Marcus had never felt more conflicted. There was a part of him that wanted to believe this was just another corporate rivalry, another high-stakes battle for control. But as he learned more about the people who were behind this attack, he realized it wasn't just about business, it was about something far deeper, something far more dangerous. The organization that had been targeting his father wasn't just a collection of rival executives or disgruntled employees. No, this group was far more insidious. They had connections everywhere, high-ranking officials, influential business leaders, military figures, and they didn't care about money or status. They wanted absolute control. They wanted to be the ones who decided the course of history. Marcus was learning quickly that power, in its rawest form, was a game of manipulation and deceit. And the more he uncovered, the more he realized just how little he actually knew about the forces at play. One night, after a long meeting with David and the rest of his father's inner circle, Marcus found himself alone in his room, staring at the files that had been given to him. His mind was swimming with the details, the covert operations, the names of potential traitors, the reports of high-level meetings that had been intercepted. But the most chilling part was a dossier on his father, a series of intelligence reports detailing Jonathan King's every move, every decision, every alliance he had ever made. It was a reminder of just how much his father had been willing to sacrifice in order to protect their family. But it was also a stark reality check. No one was untouchable, not even Jonathan King. As Marcus sat at the desk, trying to process the weight of what he was learning, a soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called out, not even looking up from the papers. The door creaked open, and a familiar face appeared in the doorway. It was Rachel, one of his father's most trusted associates, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who had been with the family for years. She was one of the few people Marcus trusted implicitly, but even her presence here made him uneasy. "You've been quiet," Rachel said, her voice smooth but with an edge. "Something on your mind?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "I don't even know where to start. This whole thing, it's not what I thought it was. I thought I was just getting pulled into some business drama. But now I'm starting to see that this is much bigger than that." Rachel stepped into the room and sat down across from him, her eyes studying him closely. "You're not wrong. This isn't just about your father's business. This is about control. These people, the ones going after your family, they've been working behind the scenes for years, infiltrating every aspect of our lives. And now they're closing in." Marcus nodded slowly, but something in Rachel's expression caught his attention. "You seem different. You know more about this than you're letting on. How deep is this really going?" Rachel's expression didn't change, but Marcus could see a flicker of something in her eyes, something like regret, maybe fear. "We've all been part of it, Marcus," Rachel said quietly. "Your father, me, the whole team. We've been in this game for a long time, trying to outsmart our enemies. But sometimes, we made alliances that we shouldn't have. Sometimes, we played the wrong hand. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. What are you saying, Rachel? That we can't trust anyone? She sighed, leaning back in her chair. Not exactly. But the lines are blurred now. Your father's been careful about keeping you out of the mess, but if we're going to win this war, you need to understand something important. Trust is a luxury we don't have anymore. Rachel's words hung in the air like a dark cloud, and for the first time, Marcus felt the weight of just how dangerous his situation was. He wasn't just a bystander anymore. He was in the middle of a deadly game, surrounded by allies who might not be as loyal as they seemed. But why tell me this now? Marcus asked, his voice steady but filled with doubt. If you've known this all along, why keep it from me? Why didn't my father tell me? Rachel's eyes softened slightly. Because he was trying to protect you. He didn't want you to have to carry the burden of knowing how deep everything goes. But the truth is, Marcus, there's no escaping it now. You're part of this. And the sooner you accept that, the better. Marcus felt a knot form in his stomach. It wasn't just the threat of losing everything he had, it was the realization that his entire life had been built on a foundation of secrets, alliances, and power plays. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to calm the storm inside him. So what do I do now? How do I fight back? Rachel stood up, her posture more resolute than ever. You start by learning everything you can. You take control of what's left. You dig deeper, Marcus. You trust no one except the people who have proven their loyalty. And when the time comes, you strike first. Marcus stared at her, his mind racing with possibilities. This was it. There was no going back. He was in this now, whether he was ready or not. David was right. The game was just beginning. Marcus's journey had only just begun. But as he stepped into the unknown, he knew one thing for sure, he would stop at nothing to protect his family's legacy. And the people who threatened them? They would regret ever crossing his path. The days seemed to stretch on, each one blurring into the next. Marcus had spent every waking hour immersing himself in the files and intelligence that had been handed to him. He could feel the weight of responsibility pressing on him, but there was no turning back. His father's empire, his family's future, was on the line. The stakes had never been higher. As the intensity of the situation grew, so did the paranoia. Marcus was no longer certain who he could trust. Rachel's cryptic warnings echoed in his mind. Trust no one except the people who have proven their loyalty. But how could he know who those people were when everyone around him was hiding something? David was still the closest thing to an ally Marcus had. Yet, despite the trust he had placed in him, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that there was something David wasn't telling him. Every conversation with David seemed to be carefully curated, as though he was holding back vital pieces of information. But at this point, Marcus wasn't sure if it was because David was protecting him, or if he was manipulating him. The sound of a soft knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. Marcus had grown accustomed to the quiet, the stillness of the compound, but something about the way the knock came, urgent, yet deliberate, set his nerves on edge. Come in, he called, standing from his desk. His heart rate quickened as the door creaked open. It was Rachel again, but this time her face was a shade paler than usual. There was no time for pleasantries. She entered the room quickly, her eyes scanning the hallway outside before closing the door behind her. We have a problem, she said in a low voice, stepping toward Marcus. Her expression was more serious than he had ever seen before. Marcus felt his stomach twist. What now? What happened? Rachel didn't waste any time. She pulled a folder from her bag and handed it to him. I've been digging. I found something. He opened the folder, his eyes scanning the contents. There was a detailed report on a meeting that had taken place just a few days ago. It was a list of names, a group of high-ranking officials in both the business and political world, each with ties to his father's company. The problem wasn't the names themselves, it was the context of the meeting. They were all talking about Jonathan King, but not in the way Marcus had expected. "They're planning something," Rachel continued, her voice grim. "It's bigger than just the takeover of your father's company. These people, they have deeper connections than we realized." Marcus scanned the report, his heart sinking. The group wasn't just talking about destroying his father's empire. They were actively plotting to erase his father's influence from the world, from history itself. They were working with people outside the corporate world, people with the power to shift the balance of global power. It was a coordinated, multifaceted effort, and Marcus had no idea how to stop it. "These people," Marcus began, swallowing hard, "they're coming after more than just the business. They want everything, don't they?" Rachel nodded. "Yes. And worse, I'm starting to think that someone inside your father's circle might be working with them." Marcus felt the floor beneath him give way. A traitor. It was the one thing he had feared most. But who? And why? He closed the folder, trying to steady his thoughts. Who can I trust, Rachel? Who can I even turn to for help? I can't fight a war with no allies. Rachel hesitated, her eyes flickering with something he couldn't quite place. "There's one person you can trust. Someone who's been with your father from the very beginning. But, there's a catch." Marcus' eyes narrowed. "What do you mean, a catch?" Rachel took a deep breath, the air in the room suddenly feeling thick with tension. "This person is powerful, Marcus. But they've made enemies on both sides. It's not going to be easy to get them on our side. And if we fail, it could be catastrophic." Marcus' mind raced. "Who is it?" Rachel met his gaze, her voice steady. "You'll find out soon enough. But you need to be prepared. This person doesn't play by the rules. They have their own agenda, and it may not align with ours." Marcus stared at her, trying to process everything she had just said. If his only option for an ally was someone with their own agenda, someone whose loyalty was questionable, how could he trust them to help him? And what if they were just another pawn in a larger game? Suddenly, a loud thud echoed through the compound, followed by the distinct sound of a gunshot. Both Marcus and Rachel froze, the blood draining from Marcus's face. "What the hell was that?" Marcus hissed, his voice tight with fear. Rachel didn't answer immediately, but her expression turned dark. "We've been compromised." Marcus felt a cold chill run through him. This wasn't just about business anymore. This was about survival. His father's enemies had finally come for him, and there was no way of knowing how many of those around him were in on it. The two of them rushed to the hallway, Marcus's heart pounding in his chest. The compound was eerily quiet now, every shadow seeming to hide a threat. They moved swiftly down the narrow corridors, passing several rooms before reaching a set of stairs that led to the security room. As they ascended, Marcus could feel the tension in the air. Everything felt wrong. And then, they reached the top of the stairs. The security room door was ajar, the light flickering inside. Rachel's hand instinctively went to the gun at her side, and she motioned for Marcus to stay close. He nodded, trying to suppress the fear that was rising in his throat. As they entered the room, Marcus froze. Inside, the body of one of his father's most trusted security officers lay lifeless on the floor. Blood pooled around him, and a large knife was embedded in his chest. Rachel bent down, checking the officer for any signs of life. "He's gone," she whispered, her voice grim. "We've got to get out of here. Now." Marcus barely heard her. His mind was spinning, his thoughts racing. This was just the beginning. Whoever was behind this, they weren't going to stop until they had taken everything from his family. "We can't leave," Marcus said, his voice shaking with determination. "We have to fight back. I'm not going to run." Rachel's eyes softened for a moment, but the hardness in them quickly returned. "You're not running, Marcus. But you have to be smart about this. You have to play the game. The game. He'd heard those words before, but now they carried a weight he couldn't ignore. This wasn't just a battle for his father's empire, it was a battle for his survival, his future. The walls were closing in, and Marcus knew one thing for certain, there was no turning back. Marcus had no choice now. The fight was on, and he wasn't going down without a fight. The night was still, the air thick with uncertainty. Marcus stood in the security room, the lifeless body of his father's trusted officer a stark reminder of how dangerous things had become. The walls seemed to close in on him, the weight of the situation pressing harder with every passing second. He had been thrust into a world of betrayal, conspiracy, and violence that he had never imagined. "We need to move," Rachel said, her voice low but commanding. She grabbed Marcus by the arm, pulling him out of the security room and into the narrow hallway. The compound was eerily quiet, the sound of their footsteps echoing through the empty halls. They could hear nothing but the rapid beating of their own hearts, the tension thick in the air. Marcus's mind raced. The betrayal had been swift, unrelenting. His father's empire was under attack, and the very people he trusted were being picked off one by one. The life he had known, the life of privilege and certainty, was unraveling before his eyes. As they moved down the hall, Rachel stopped abruptly, her hand tightening around Marcus's wrist. "Listen," she whispered. Marcus paused, straining his ears. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, faintly, in the distance, he heard voices, low murmurs, the faint shuffle of feet. Someone was coming. "Get down," Rachel hissed, pulling Marcus toward a nearby closet and yanking the door open. Marcus didn't argue. His adrenaline surged as he crouched down beside her, heart pounding in his chest. He barely had time to react before Rachel slammed the door shut, plunging them both into darkness. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and Marcus held his breath. The voices grew clearer. There were at least 2 people, maybe more, moving quickly toward their position. One voice sounded familiar, faint but recognizable. It was David. "Get to the safe house," David's voice called out in a low, urgent tone. "We need to make sure we're one step ahead of them." "Do you think they'll follow us?" a second voice asked, more concerned. "They'll follow," David replied, his tone unwavering. "But we'll be ready. Marcus needs to understand, this is just the beginning. They're making their move." The weight of David's words sank in like a stone in Marcus's stomach. They had been found. His father's enemies were closing in. They knew about the safe house, and they were preparing for whatever was coming next. Rachel's grip on Marcus's arm tightened. She was listening intently, her face a mask of concentration. She nodded slowly, eyes flickering to Marcus in the darkness. "We need to get out of here," Rachel whispered. "The safe house is compromised. We can't stay in the compound. If they know where it is, they'll be on us in minutes." Marcus nodded, fear flooding his veins. But there was a fire inside him now, an urgency. He had to stop this. He wasn't just going to run away and hope it all blew over. He couldn't let them destroy everything his family had worked for. Not without a fight. "Where do we go?" Marcus whispered. Rachel didn't hesitate. "We go to the one place no one will think to look." Hours later, after sneaking through the back corridors of the compound and evading detection, Marcus and Rachel arrived at a secluded garage on the edge of the property. The building was old, tucked away from the main part of the compound. It was a place Marcus had never paid much attention to before, but as Rachel led him inside, he realized just how important it was. The garage was well maintained, with a single black SUV parked in the corner. Rachel walked toward the vehicle, her movements fluid and efficient. She opened the door and slid into the driver's seat without saying a word. Marcus followed her, his mind still reeling from everything that had happened. "What's the plan?" he asked as he buckled in. Rachel glanced at him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "We need to contact the people who can help us. But we need to do it without drawing attention. We go off the grid for now. Lay low until we figure out who we can trust. As they drove through the darkened streets, Marcus couldn't help but feel the weight of everything crashing down on him. His father's empire, the betrayals, the looming threat of an all-out war, it was all too much. And yet, he couldn't deny the fire burning inside him. For the first time in his life, he was facing something bigger than himself. And he wasn't going to back down. Rachel's voice broke through his thoughts. Marcus, listen. I know this is hard, but we have to stay sharp. There are people in your father's inner circle who want to see him, and you, dead. You need to be ready for anything. Marcus looked at her, his eyes narrowing. Who? Who's behind this? Rachel was silent for a moment. She glanced at him, her face hardening. The people you least expect. The ones who've been feeding your father false information for years. But there's someone else pulling the strings, someone even more dangerous. I don't know who it is yet, but we're going to find out. The SUV hummed steadily along the road, the glow of streetlights casting fleeting shadows across the dashboard. Marcus's mind was a whirlwind of questions. Who could be behind this? Who had the power to threaten everything his father had worked so hard to build? And then it hit him, something he hadn't considered before. His father had always played by the rules, but what if the people behind this didn't care about the rules? What if they wanted to bring down everything, not just his father's empire, but the entire system that had allowed people like him to rise to power in the first place? That thought sent a chill down his spine. The stakes were higher than he had imagined. The game wasn't just about business anymore. It was about power, and who would control it. As the vehicle sped through the quiet streets, Marcus's resolve grew stronger. His father had spent a lifetime building an empire. Now, it was his turn to protect it. Rachel turned onto a side road, and Marcus's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden blaring noise from her phone. She glanced at the screen, her face tightening as she read the message. Damn it, she muttered under her breath. She looked at Marcus, her eyes darkening. They've already found us. We need to move, now. Before Marcus could ask what was going on, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. A sense of urgency gripped him, and all at once, everything felt out of control. They weren't safe. The clock was ticking. Get ready, Marcus, Rachel said, her voice low but steady. The real fight starts now. As the sirens grew louder and closer, Marcus knew one thing for certain, his world had just been turned upside down. There was no going back. The battle for everything his father had built, and for his own survival, was just beginning. It was time for Marcus to step into the abyss. The only question now was how far he would be willing to go to protect the legacy he had inherited. The sirens were growing louder, their wails sending a cold shiver through Marcus's spine. He could feel the urgency in Rachel's movements, her hands gripping the steering wheel with an intensity that matched the chaos now unfolding around them. Every second counted. There was no time to waste. Stay focused, Marcus, Rachel's voice broke through the mounting tension, her tone low but firm. They're not just after you, they're after everything your family has built. You need to stay one step ahead of them, no matter what. Marcus's mind was racing. The weight of Rachel's words hung heavy on his shoulders. One step ahead. It seemed impossible, given how close they were to being caught. He glanced out the window, watching the blur of streetlights pass by as they took a series of sharp turns, trying to shake off the tailing vehicles. But the sirens weren't the only threat they had to deal with. Rachel's phone buzzed again, and this time, she didn't hesitate. She glanced down at the screen, her expression darkening. They've got eyes on us, she muttered under her breath, slamming her foot on the accelerator. It's not just the police. Someone else is hunting us down. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. Someone else. The realization hit him hard, this wasn't just about an internal corporate conspiracy. Whoever was orchestrating this had resources beyond anything he had anticipated. They had contacts within the law, people in positions of power, and they were using all of it to close in on him. Who? Marcus asked, his voice hoarse from the fear that was clawing at his throat. Rachel didn't answer immediately, her focus fully on the road. The car swerved as they navigated through an alleyway, narrowly avoiding a group of vehicles blocking their path. The sound of screeching tires filled the air as Rachel expertly maneuvered the SUV, putting distance between them and their pursuers. "They're part of the network your father built," she finally replied, her voice tight. "I didn't want to believe it, but I think it's true. There's a faction within your father's company that's been feeding information to our enemies. People you've known for years. They've been playing both sides for a long time." Marcus felt his stomach churn. Traitors within the ranks. It was a nightmare he had never even considered, his father's closest allies, the very people who had helped build his empire, now working against him. He shook his head, trying to process everything. Who are they? Who's behind this? Rachel's eyes flickered to him briefly before returning to the road. "I don't know yet, but we're going to find out. There's someone who can help us." Before Marcus could ask who that was, Rachel slammed on the brakes, sending them skidding to a halt in front of a nondescript building. The sign was old, barely visible in the dim light, but Marcus could see the words clearly: "Safe House, authorized personnel only." Rachel's eyes darted around the area before she turned off the engine. "We're here. Stay close, and keep your head down. Trust no one." Marcus didn't need to be told twice. He followed Rachel closely as she led him into the building, his mind still reeling from everything he had just learned. His father's enemies were closer than he thought. It wasn't just a fight for power anymore, it was a battle for his very survival. As they entered the building, Marcus was struck by the contrast to the chaos outside. The interior was calm, almost sterile, with white walls and a few pieces of functional furniture scattered about. It looked like a place meant for strategy and secrecy, and Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that it had been prepared for moments like this. Rachel walked confidently toward a door at the end of the hall, punching in a code on the keypad next to it. The door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a small, dimly lit room inside. A man was seated at a desk, staring at a bank of monitors. His back was to them, but Marcus recognized him immediately. "Vincent," Rachel said, her voice laced with urgency. "We need your help." The man, Vincent, turned slowly, his sharp eyes sizing up Marcus before locking onto Rachel. His face was older, grizzled, with a few scars that hinted at a life filled with danger. He wasn't the kind of person Marcus was used to dealing with, he wasn't part of the high society world Marcus had grown up in. But right now, that didn't matter. "What's going on?" Vincent asked, his voice gravelly. "You look like you've been on the run." Rachel didn't waste time with pleasantries. "They're closing in on us. There's a mole in your father's company, and it's worse than we thought. We need to know who's behind this and how to stop them." Vincent's eyes narrowed, and he stood from his chair, walking over to a nearby cabinet. He pulled out a file, handing it to Rachel without saying a word. "This is everything I've been able to gather," he said, his voice steady. "It's a list of people who've been meeting with the enemies you're dealing with. Some of them have been working with them for years, but they've kept it under wraps. It's been a slow burn, but now it's ready to explode." Marcus took the file from Rachel's hands and opened it. His eyes scanned the list of names, familiar faces, people he had trusted, people who had been part of his father's inner circle for as long as he could remember. "Why didn't you tell me about this sooner?" Marcus asked, his voice tight with frustration. Vincent didn't flinch. "I wasn't sure you could handle it. But now that it's clear they've put a target on your back, we don't have time for hesitation." Rachel turned to Marcus, her eyes filled with determination. "We need to expose them before they get the chance to move against us. We need to move fast." Marcus nodded, taking a deep breath. He was finally starting to understand the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just a fight to protect his father's empire. It was a fight to protect everything they had built, everything he had taken for granted. "We're going to need more than just this list," Marcus said, looking at Vincent. "We need to track their every move. We need to know how deep this goes." Vincent grinned, a cold smile that sent a chill down Marcus's spine. "I've already got that covered. I've been keeping tabs on them for a while. We'll find out who's pulling the strings." Marcus's resolve solidified. This wasn't just a battle for survival. This was a war, and he was ready to fight. Back in the car, as they prepared to leave the safe house, Rachel looked at Marcus with a steely resolve. "This is just the beginning, Marcus. What you're about to uncover will change everything. But you have to be ready for the truth." Marcus took a deep breath, the weight of her words sinking in. The truth. He had no idea what it would cost him to uncover it, but one thing was certain: he wasn't going to back down. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. Marcus is about to uncover the deepest secrets of his father's empire, but can he handle the truth? Do you think he's ready for what's coming? The silence in the car was deafening as Marcus stared out the window, his mind processing everything he had just learned. Vincent's cryptic words echoed in his mind, each one heavier than the last. This was no longer just about power or wealth, it was about survival. His father's empire, the people he had trusted, the world he had built, everything was on the line. Rachel's grip tightened on the steering wheel, her eyes focused on the road ahead, her face set in an expression of unwavering determination. She had been in this world longer than Marcus, but he could tell that even she wasn't fully prepared for what was coming next. They had left the safe house with the list Vincent had given them, a list of names and information that seemed more like a puzzle than a solution. Who could they trust? Who was still loyal to his father? Every face on that list had once been a part of Marcus's life, but now, they were nothing but potential threats. "Where are we going?" Marcus asked, his voice breaking the silence. Rachel didn't answer immediately. She drove for a few moments before turning down a dimly lit street, the car's headlights casting long shadows across the pavement. "There's someone who can help us get answers. Someone who knows more than anyone else about what's really going on. We need to find him before they do." Marcus's heart raced. He had no idea who this person was or why Rachel trusted them, but right now, he was willing to follow her lead. They had no other choice. The car came to a stop in front of an old building, nothing special, just another nondescript structure in the middle of a quiet neighborhood. Rachel cut the engine and looked at Marcus, her expression serious. "This is it," she said. "Stay close. Trust no one." They exited the vehicle and made their way toward the building, the weight of the moment hanging over them. As they entered the building, Marcus immediately felt the difference. The air was thick with tension, and the walls seemed to pulse with an energy he couldn't quite place. It was as if the entire place was alive with secrets, just waiting to be uncovered. Rachel led him down a narrow hallway, the sound of their footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. They came to a door at the end of the corridor, and Rachel knocked twice before entering without waiting for a response. Inside was a man Marcus had never seen before. He was seated at a desk, a laptop in front of him, his face illuminated by the glow of the screen. He looked up when they entered, his sharp eyes taking in Marcus's presence with a kind of cold calculation. "This is Marcus," Rachel said, her voice firm. "We need your help." The man, who Marcus soon learned was named Elias, studied him for a moment before nodding. "I know who you are," he said, his voice calm but edged with a sense of authority. "Your father's legacy is far-reaching, but it's also fragile. And right now, it's in danger of collapsing." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. "You know what's happening?" Elias didn't answer right away. Instead, he motioned for them to sit. As they took their seats, he opened a file on his laptop, revealing a series of encrypted documents. The information was overwhelming: names, dates, meetings, and connections to people Marcus had never even heard of. There are people inside your father's organization who've been working with those who want to see it destroyed, Elias said, his tone matter-of-fact. It's a well-organized group, and they've infiltrated every level of your father's empire. They've been feeding information to your enemies, making sure that the right people are in the right places to bring everything down. Marcus leaned forward, his mind racing. Who are they? Why are they doing this? Elias took a deep breath, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. There are two key players we know of. One is an insider, someone who's been working with your father for years. The other is a shadow figure, someone who's pulling the strings from behind the scenes. Their endgame is to destabilize your family's influence and take control of the company. Marcus's mind spun. An insider, someone close to his father. The thought was almost too much to process. He couldn't believe it. How could someone his father trusted be involved in this? Who are these people? Marcus asked, his voice tight with a mix of disbelief and anger. Elias didn't hesitate. He clicked on a file and turned the laptop toward Marcus. The screen displayed several names and faces, some familiar, some not. But there, at the top of the list, was the name that made Marcus's blood run cold. David, Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. David, his father's most trusted advisor, the man who had been by his side for years, the man who had mentored him through the ups and downs of the business world. The man Marcus had always trusted without question. David? Marcus repeated, his voice shaking with disbelief. How, why? Elias's eyes met his. David is part of a larger network. He's been feeding your father's enemies information for years, making sure they always stay one step ahead. But he's not the only one. There are others within your father's circle who've been working with him. They've been gathering intel, sabotaging operations, and slowly taking control of key assets. Marcus's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. David. The betrayal felt like a punch to the gut, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. This can't be happening, Marcus muttered, his fists clenched in anger. I trusted him. Rachel placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip firm but comforting. I know it's hard, Marcus. But you need to understand this, the people we're dealing with are dangerous. They're not just after your father, they're after you. And if we don't act fast, they'll destroy everything. Marcus looked at the screen again, his gaze lingering on David's face. The man who had helped him grow, who had been a mentor, a father figure. He had been feeding information to their enemies all along. This is just the beginning, Elias said quietly, as if reading Marcus's thoughts. The deeper we dig, the more we'll uncover. But it won't be easy. They'll do everything in their power to keep you from finding out the truth. Marcus took a deep breath, the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. He couldn't afford to waste time. His father's empire was on the brink of collapse, and the man he had trusted most was behind it all. But now, he had a choice to make. He could walk away, let the people who had betrayed him win. Or he could fight. He could take down the men and women who had destroyed everything he had ever known. And he would start with David. As they prepared to leave Elias's office, Marcus felt a shift inside him. He wasn't the same person who had walked in just hours before. His fear had turned to resolve, and his anger had transformed into something more powerful, a thirst for justice. He would uncover every last secret, no matter the cost. Rachel turned to him as they stepped out into the night, her voice steady and reassuring. You're ready, Marcus. But remember, this won't be easy. They'll come for you. They'll try to break you. But you can't let them. Marcus nodded, his gaze hardening. I won't let them. Not now. Not ever. Marcus didn't sleep that night. After Elias had revealed the truth, he couldn't shake the images of the faces on the screen, each one a reminder of betrayal. David. The name echoed in his mind like a constant hum, a painful reminder of how far the people closest to him had gone to destroy everything he had known. As much as he tried to close his eyes, the anger burned too fiercely within him. Rachel had stayed silent after they left Elias's safe house. She didn't need to say anything more. Marcus knew what he had to do. The next morning, the sun had barely risen when Rachel called him, her voice crisp and commanding. "Meet me at the hangar. It's time to make our move." The hangar, Marcus knew exactly what she meant. It wasn't just a place where his father's private jets were kept. It was a symbol of everything his family had built. The fact that he was about to walk into that hangar, armed with the knowledge of everything that had been done behind his back, made his heart race. The car ride was a blur. The world outside passed by as though it were someone else's reality. Nothing felt real anymore. Not his father's empire, not the trust he'd placed in people like David. The life he had known was slipping through his fingers, and all he had left was this feeling, a gnawing need for justice. Rachel didn't say much as she drove. The tension in the air was palpable. The mission ahead was too important for small talk. When they reached the hangar, Marcus could feel the weight of the moment. The hangar loomed before him, silent and cold, a giant metal structure that once symbolized his family's success. Now, it felt like the site of a battlefield. Rachel parked the car, and Marcus stepped out, his gaze hardening. "What's the plan?" Rachel handed him a briefcase. "Inside, we have everything we need to expose David. The documents, the meeting logs, everything. You're going to confront him, and we're going to make sure he doesn't get away with this." Marcus took the briefcase, feeling its weight settle into his hands. There was no turning back now. His heart beat faster as they walked toward the hangar's massive doors. Inside, the familiar smell of polished metal and jet fuel filled the air. The place felt almost abandoned. The jets were lined up along the runway, but no staff were present. The silence was oppressive, and Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting, something darker than the betrayals he had already uncovered. As they approached the back office, Marcus felt a sense of unease. He knew David's office was here, somewhere in the bowels of the hangar. It was always where the top-tier meetings took place, private, secure, away from prying eyes. But today, it felt different. This wasn't a place of luxury or comfort anymore. It was a place where deals were made in the shadows, where people like David had been pulling the strings without anyone knowing. Rachel stopped in front of a door, turning to Marcus. "You ready for this?" He nodded, though his insides were churning. "Let's end this." Rachel pressed a button on her phone, and a soft beep indicated that the door was unlocked. She pushed it open slowly. The room inside was dimly lit, filled with sleek furniture and the faint glow of monitors. At the far end of the room stood David, a man Marcus had once considered a mentor, now the very embodiment of everything he had learned to distrust. David stood with his back to them, looking out over the runway as though the world beyond was more important than what was happening in the room. He didn't seem surprised when they entered. "I knew you would come," David said quietly, not turning around. His voice was calm, almost detached. It was only a matter of time. Marcus's pulse quickened. There was no anger in David's tone, no remorse, just cold, calculated confidence. "Why, David?" Marcus's voice was steady, but his fists were clenched at his sides. "Why betray my family? Why destroy everything we've built?" David turned slowly, his eyes meeting Marcus's with an almost pitying gaze. "You don't understand, Marcus. You never have. This empire, your father's legacy, it's a fragile thing. It's built on power, on influence, and it's only as strong as the people who hold it. And I've watched as your father let that power slip through his fingers. He became a puppet, and I couldn't just stand by and watch as it all unraveled." Marcus's chest tightened. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "So, you decided to tear it all down? You decided to betray us all for what? Power?" David's lips curled into a smile, but there was no warmth in it. "Power? No, Marcus. Not power. Control. Control of the future. Control of what's coming next. Your father, for all his brilliance, was blind to what was coming. The world is changing, and your father was stuck in the past. I'm simply positioning myself to lead when the time comes. This isn't betrayal. It's survival. Marcus couldn't process the coldness in David's eyes. The man who had once been his father's right hand had become a shadow, someone willing to destroy everything for a chance at power. You don't get it, Marcus said, his voice rising. You think this is about control? About survival? This is about loyalty. This is about family. And you, he broke off, the anger overwhelming him. You're not just betraying my father. You're betraying me. You're betraying everything I've worked for. David's expression didn't change. Your father was weak, Marcus. He couldn't see it, but I could. And now you're here, just like I knew you would be. It's all part of the plan. A sharp silence fell between them, the weight of David's words hanging in the air like an ominous cloud. Marcus was trembling with fury. Every word David spoke only deepened the wound in Marcus's heart. This wasn't just betrayal, it was a calculated assault on everything Marcus had trusted and believed in. It was a deliberate destruction of the future his family had worked so hard to build. Rachel stepped forward, her presence a silent but powerful reminder that they weren't here just to listen. We have proof of everything, David, she said, her voice cold. You can't hide anymore. The people you've been working with, the deals you've made, it's all here. David didn't flinch. You think exposing me changes anything? The people I've aligned with are far more powerful than you realize. You're just one step away from losing everything. I've already won. Marcus's resolve hardened. The man in front of him was delusional. It was time to end this, time to expose the truth, no matter the cost. You haven't won, Marcus said, his voice low and steady. This isn't over. David laughed, but it was hollow, devoid of real joy. We'll see, Marcus. We'll see. Rachel motioned toward the door. Let's go, Marcus. This ends now. As they left the room, the weight of the moment settled in. Marcus knew this was only the beginning. The battle for his father's legacy had just begun, and the stakes were higher than ever. Are you okay? Rachel asked softly as they made their way back to the car. Marcus didn't answer immediately. The world was changing around him, and his understanding of everything he thought he knew was unraveling. But one thing was certain now, he wasn't going to let David or anyone else tear his world apart. No turning back. The air outside the hangar was heavy with tension as Marcus and Rachel climbed back into the car. The silence between them felt suffocating, as though every word had already been spoken and there was nothing more to say. Marcus's mind raced, the confrontation with David replaying in his head over and over again. Every word, every lie, it all felt like a betrayal too profound to be real. As they drove, the weight of the situation became clearer. Marcus had expected to feel triumphant after confronting David, to feel as if he had reclaimed control. But instead, he felt hollow, unsure of what to do next. The man he had once trusted had revealed that everything he had known was part of a much larger game, one he wasn't prepared to play. Rachel broke the silence, her voice firm but compassionate. You did the right thing, Marcus. But we're not done yet. This is just the start. I know, he replied quietly, his eyes staring straight ahead. But how do we even know who to trust now? Who else has been playing us? Rachel's grip tightened on the steering wheel as she navigated the quiet streets. That's the question we need to answer. There are too many people involved in this, too many players. But we've got the information now, and we've got to use it. Marcus turned to look at her, his brow furrowed. I don't understand. We exposed David, but he's right. We're up against more than just him. There's someone else pulling the strings. Exactly, Rachel said, her eyes narrowing. David's just the tip of the iceberg. He's part of something much bigger, something we're only starting to uncover. But I've been in this world long enough to know how to play the game. We just need to find the right people, the ones who can help us bring down the rest. Marcus swallowed hard, his thoughts still a whirlwind. The truth was, he wasn't sure who he could trust anymore. Elias had given them a list, names of people inside his father's empire who were connected to the conspiracy. But the deeper he looked, the more questions arose. Who was truly loyal? Who had been compromised? Rachel must have sensed his doubt. She glanced at him briefly before speaking again. You don't have to do this alone. You've got people who are in your corner. Me, Elias, we've all been through the fire. But we need to keep moving forward. We can't afford to stop. Marcus nodded, though the doubt still lingered. He had to keep moving, keep pushing forward, but where? Where did they even go from here? The next few days felt like a blur. Marcus spent hours poring over the documents Elias had provided, piecing together the names and connections. Every lead he followed seemed to take him deeper into a world of shadowy figures, secret meetings, and veiled threats. The more he uncovered, the more he realized how much of his father's empire had been built on secrecy and deceit. There were layers upon layers of manipulation, and it was clear that David had only been one part of a larger machine. But as Marcus dug deeper, he began to uncover something else, something more dangerous. There were whispers of a figure, one who had never been publicly associated with the empire. A shadow, moving quietly in the background, controlling everything from behind the scenes. This was the person Marcus needed to find. If he could figure out who this was, maybe, just maybe, they could put an end to the chaos David had started. Rachel was by his side every step of the way. She had made a few calls, tried to reach out to people she trusted, but the response was always the same, silence. It was as though the entire world had conspired to keep him in the dark. One evening, as Marcus stared at a map of connections laid out across his desk, Rachel entered the room, her face grim. "We need to move fast," she said, her voice low and urgent. "I just got word from Elias. There's been a shift. Someone's trying to take control of the company before we can expose them. The clock is ticking." Marcus's heart sank. Who? "David's not the only one working in the shadows," Rachel said. "There's someone else. A figure who's been pulling strings from behind the scenes. We think they're trying to accelerate the takeover, before we can stop them." Marcus's mind raced. How do we stop them? Who is it? Rachel shook her head. "That's what we need to figure out. But I have a feeling we're getting close." The next morning, they met Elias in a secure location, a place hidden from prying eyes. The tension between them was palpable as Elias laid out the latest information he had gathered. "We've confirmed that there's someone else, someone we've been overlooking. A business partner of your father's, someone who's been quietly moving into position. Their influence in the company has been growing steadily, and they've been working with David all along." Marcus's stomach churned. He had trusted this person, had known them for years. They had been a regular presence in his life, someone his father had always spoken highly of. "Who is it?" Marcus demanded, his voice tight with anger. Elias hesitated for a moment before finally answering. "It's Richard Turner." Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. Richard Turner. The man was more than just a business partner, he was like family. He had been there at every milestone, every celebration, every event. Richard had always been the calm, steady presence, the one Marcus's father had leaned on when things got tough. And now, it seemed, he was one of the very people who had been conspiring against them. "Are you sure?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. His gut had been telling him something was off for weeks, but this was beyond anything he could have imagined. Elias nodded. "We've traced the connections. Richard Turner has been feeding information to David for years. And now, with your father out of the picture, he's moving to take control of the company. Marcus clenched his fists, his knuckles white with rage. How could he? How could someone I've known my entire life betray us like this? Rachel placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice soft but firm. We can't let anger cloud our judgment. We need to be smart. This is bigger than personal betrayal. We're talking about the future of your family's legacy. We have to stop him. Marcus took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus. Richard Turner had to be stopped. But Marcus knew it wouldn't be easy. The man was powerful, influential, and had already moved into the shadows. They couldn't just walk into his office and confront him. They would have to outsmart him, find a way to expose him for who he really was. As they left the meeting with Elias, Marcus felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Everything he had known, everything he had trusted, was falling apart. But there was one thing that remained, his resolve. He wasn't going to let this empire, his family's legacy, be destroyed by people who had no loyalty, no honor. He would fight back. He would find a way to take down Richard Turner, no matter the cost. And as they drove away, Marcus made a vow to himself. He would expose the man who had betrayed his family, and he would make sure that the truth came out, no matter what it took. The game had only just begun. And Marcus was ready to play. Marcus sat alone in his room, staring at the city lights beyond his window. The glow of the skyline did little to quiet the storm raging inside him. He had spent the last few days replaying the incident over and over in his head, every humiliating moment, every word spoken by those who had dismissed him so easily. The world had watched his pain unfold, turning his private moment of indignity into a viral sensation. He should have felt empowered. After all, people were listening to him. His story had ignited conversations about racial discrimination and corporate accountability. But all Marcus felt was exhaustion and confusion. Why did this happen? He whispered, his voice barely audible. His father, Jonathan, had always told him that the world wasn't fair. He had grown up hearing stories of struggle, of perseverance, of what it meant to be a black man in America. And yet, knowing it and experiencing it were two entirely different things. His fists clenched as a fresh wave of anger surged through him. Was I just some symbol now? Some talking point in a debate? He hated the feeling. He didn't want to be the poster child for injustice. He just wanted to live his life without always having to prove his worth. A soft knock on his door pulled him from his thoughts. He knew who it was before he even answered. "Come in, Dad." Jonathan entered, his face a mixture of concern and understanding. He sat beside Marcus on the bed, taking a moment before speaking. "I know this is hard," he said gently. "I know it feels overwhelming." Marcus let out a bitter laugh. "That's an understatement. Everyone expects me to be this voice for change. But what if I'm not strong enough? What if I don't even know what I stand for?" Jonathan sighed, placing a firm hand on his son's shoulder. "No one is born knowing all the answers, Marcus. Even the greatest leaders struggled with doubt. But what matters is how you choose to move forward." Marcus shook his head. "What if I don't want this? I didn't ask to be in the spotlight. I just wanted to fly home. I didn't want to become a statement." Jonathan nodded slowly. "I get it. But sometimes, life puts us in places we never expected. And we have a choice, we can either step back or step up. No one is saying you have to take on the whole world. But you do have a voice, and people are listening." Marcus exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. I don't know if I can carry this." Jonathan's eyes softened. "Then don't carry it alone. You have me. You have your family. And you have something even more important, you have the truth. And the truth has power." For a long moment, Marcus sat in silence, letting his father's words settle over him. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know if he was ready. But maybe, just maybe, he could start by taking one step forward. What if I do speak out? What if I try? He asked hesitantly. Jonathan's lips curved into a small smile. Then you'll be doing something most people are too afraid to do, standing up for what's right. Marcus looked back out at the city, the light stretching endlessly before him. He still felt the weight of the injustice, the sting of humiliation. But alongside it, a new feeling was beginning to rise, determination. Maybe he didn't have to carry it all. But he could carry a piece of it. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to start something bigger. The minutes passed in silence as father and son sat together, lost in their own thoughts. Jonathan finally stood up, placing a reassuring hand on Marcus's shoulder before heading to the door. Get some rest, son. Tomorrow is another day. Marcus nodded but didn't move. He wasn't sure he'd be able to sleep. His mind was still racing, emotions still raw. He grabbed his phone, scrolling through the countless messages and notifications. There were words of encouragement, anger, and even some hate. The weight of public attention felt suffocating. He tossed the phone onto his nightstand and leaned back against his pillows, staring at the ceiling. What if he failed? What if people called him a fraud? What if his voice didn't matter? A deep sigh escaped him. He thought back to his father's words, no one is born knowing all the answers. Maybe he didn't have to figure it all out tonight. Maybe just deciding to try was enough for now. His thoughts drifted back to the moment it all started, being pulled out of first class, the embarrassment, the anger, the disbelief. He remembered the looks on people's faces, the indifference in the flight attendant's voice. The way security had treated him like a threat rather than a passenger who had done nothing wrong. The pain was still fresh, but something else was emerging from it, a sense of purpose. Marcus sat up again, reaching for his laptop. He hesitated only for a moment before opening a blank document. If he was going to speak out, he needed to be clear about what he wanted to say. He needed to understand his own feelings, his own position. He started typing, not worrying about perfect words or polished statements. He wrote about what had happened, how it made him feel, and what he wished people understood. He wrote about the fear, the doubt, and the frustration. And as he typed, something surprising happened, he started to feel lighter. The thoughts swirling in his mind finally had somewhere to go. An hour passed before he realized it, the screen filled with paragraphs of raw, unfiltered emotion. He reread his words, feeling the weight of them. Maybe this was the first step. Maybe this was how he found his voice. He saved the document and closed his laptop, finally feeling the pull of exhaustion. As he lay back down, a quiet determination settled over him. He didn't have all the answers, and he might never have them all. But he had his truth. And tomorrow, he'd decide what to do with it. For the first time in days, Marcus felt a glimmer of something other than doubt, hope. Marcus woke up feeling an unfamiliar sense of purpose. The night before had been filled with doubt, fear, and anger, but this morning was different. The emotions still lingered, but they no longer felt paralyzing. Instead, they fueled something deeper, determination. He sat at his desk, opening the document he had started the night before. His own words stared back at him, raw and honest. He reread the sentences, feeling the weight of each one. This wasn't just about what had happened to him. It was about something bigger. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. His father stepped inside, a knowing look in his eyes. "How are you feeling today?" Jonathan asked, sitting down across from him. Marcus exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Better, I think." Still confused, but better. Jonathan nodded. "That's progress." He paused before continuing. "Have you thought about what you want to do next?" Marcus hesitated, then nodded. "I have. I think I want to do something. Not just talk about it, but actually do something." Jonathan leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "What does doing something look like to you?" Marcus had been asking himself the same question all morning. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't an activist. He was just a kid who had been wronged. But maybe, just maybe, that was enough. "I want to talk to the airline," Marcus said, surprising even himself. "Not just through statements or interviews. I want to face them. I want to tell them directly how they made me feel. How they make people like me feel." Jonathan studied his son for a long moment before nodding. "That's a bold step, Marcus. And an important one. If this is what you want, I'll support you." Marcus swallowed. "I don't want to do this alone." "You won't," Jonathan assured him. "But this needs to be your decision. No one else's." Marcus took a deep breath. "Then I want to do it." A few hours later, Marcus and Jonathan sat in a sleek, modern conference room inside one of the city's tallest buildings. Across from them sat a group of airline executives, their expressions varying from polite interest to barely concealed discomfort. At the head of the table sat Emma Carter, the CEO of the airline, her carefully practiced corporate smile in place. "Thank you for meeting with us, Ms. Carter," Jonathan said, his voice calm but firm. Emma nodded. "Of course. We take these matters very seriously. We appreciate the opportunity to discuss any concerns you may have." Marcus studied her, feeling a slow burn of irritation at the rehearsed tone of her voice. He had spent days drowning in the humiliation of what happened, and yet to her, it seemed like just another PR crisis to handle. He took a deep breath. This was his moment. He had to make it count. "I don't think you understand what happened," Marcus said, his voice steady. "I wasn't just taken out of first class. I was treated like a criminal. I was humiliated, embarrassed, made to feel like I didn't belong." Emma shifted slightly in her seat. "Mr. Williams, we deeply regret how the situation unfolded." "No," Marcus interrupted, his voice sharper now. "You regret that it was caught on camera. You regret that it went viral. But do you actually regret treating me like I was a threat?" A tense silence filled the room. One of the executives, a middle-aged man with thinning hair, cleared his throat. "Marcus, we understand your frustration. We've already begun reviewing our policies." Marcus shook his head. "Policies won't change the way people look at someone like me and assume the worst. Policies won't change the fact that no one questioned the flight attendant who accused me. They just believed her, because she didn't look like me." Jonathan placed a steady hand on his son's shoulder, offering silent support. Marcus took another deep breath, steadying himself. He wasn't here to argue. He was here to be heard. "I don't want apologies," Marcus continued. "I want to know what you're going to do to make sure this doesn't happen again." Emma folded her hands on the table. "We are committed to ensuring that all passengers are treated with fairness and respect. We're working on expanding our diversity training and reviewing our complaint protocols to prevent situations like this in the future." Marcus narrowed his eyes. "Diversity training? That's it?" He shook his head. "That's not enough. I want real changes. I want you to make it clear, through actions, not words, that you won't let this happen to anyone else." Another executive leaned forward. "And what do you suggest?" Marcus met his gaze. "Start by holding people accountable. The flight attendant who falsely accused me, what happened to her?" The executives exchanged glances. Finally, Emma spoke. "She was placed on leave while we investigate." Marcus scoffed. "So she still has her job?" Emma hesitated. "We have procedures we must follow." Marcus clenched his jaw. "Then change the procedures. Because right now, all this meeting proves is that your company will only act when people are watching." Another long silence stretched across the room. Jonathan finally spoke. "Marcus has a point. Change isn't about protecting a brand. It's about doing what's right." Emma exhaled. "We're willing to listen, Marcus. If you have proposals for how we can improve, we're open to hearing them. Marcus wasn't sure if this was genuine or just another corporate tactic. But for the first time, he saw something shift in Emma's expression, something that almost resembled respect. "I'll hold you to that," he said firmly. "Because I'm not going away." The meeting ended with handshakes and promises, but Marcus knew that words were just the beginning. If he wanted real change, he'd have to keep pushing. As he and his father stepped out of the building, Marcus felt something different within himself. This wasn't just about what had happened to him anymore. This was about making sure it didn't happen to anyone else. He wasn't just speaking out. He was taking responsibility. And he wasn't stopping now. Marcus adjusted his blazer as he stepped into the gleaming corporate office of Horizon Airlines. The walls were lined with framed photos of planes soaring through the sky, accompanied by motivational quotes about excellence and innovation. The irony was almost laughable. After everything he had been through, he was about to confront the very people who had dismissed him so easily. Jonathan walked beside him, his presence a silent pillar of support. They had spent the last few days preparing for this moment, anticipating every possible argument, every deflection the airline's leadership might attempt. But no amount of preparation could fully steady the nerves thrumming in Marcus's chest. "You ready?" Jonathan asked, his voice calm but firm. Marcus exhaled slowly, forcing himself to meet his father's eyes. "I have to be." A receptionist led them into a conference room where several executives were already seated. At the head of the table was Emma Carter, the CEO of Horizon Airlines. She was a sharp-featured woman with neatly styled blonde hair and an air of practiced authority. As Marcus and Jonathan took their seats, she offered a tight-lipped smile. "Mr. Carter, Mr. Hamilton," she greeted, nodding to each of them. "Thank you for coming in today. We understand you have concerns, and we're eager to address them." Marcus folded his hands on the table, willing himself to remain composed. "Concerns?" he echoed. "I was humiliated in front of an entire plane full of people. I was treated like I didn't belong, like I was a criminal. And you call that concerns?" Emma's expression barely shifted. "We understand that the situation was upsetting, and I deeply regret that you felt that way. It was never our intention to." "Don't do that," Marcus interrupted, his voice sharper than he had intended. "Don't say it wasn't your intention. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding. This is about a pattern, a system that allows things like this to happen over and over again. If I weren't who I am, if I didn't have the resources and the platform to fight back, you wouldn't even be sitting here right now." A murmur of agreement passed through a few of the executives, but Emma remained composed. "We take all allegations of discrimination seriously," she said. "That's why we've conducted an internal review of the incident and have taken steps to ensure that our staff undergoes additional training on inclusivity and bias awareness." Marcus clenched his jaw. "Training isn't enough. I don't want an apology or some PR stunt that makes it look like you care. I want actual change. I want policies that prevent this from happening to the next person who looks like me. I want a commitment that Horizon Airlines will not just brush this under the rug once the media moves on." Jonathan leaned forward, his voice measured but resolute. "We've spoken to legal experts, civil rights advocates, and community leaders. There's a clear path forward if your company is serious about addressing these issues. Implement real accountability measures. Establish a transparent review board for discrimination complaints. Make sure your policies protect all passengers, not just the ones who fit a certain image." Emma exhaled slowly, tapping her manicured nails against the table. "These are significant changes you're asking for. Changes that require time, resources, and the alternative?" Marcus cut in. "The alternative is more stories like mine. More public outrage. More lawsuits. Is that really the reputation you want for Horizon Airlines?" A tense silence filled the room. The executives exchanged glances, the weight of Marcus's words pressing down on them. Finally, Emma leaned back in her chair, studying him with an unreadable expression. "You're passionate, Marcus," she said. "I respect that. And I won't deny that Horizon has areas where we need to improve. We'll take your concerns into account as we move forward." Marcus narrowed his eyes. "That's not good enough. I want commitments, not vague promises." Emma sighed, but before she could respond, another executive, a middle-aged black man Marcus hadn't noticed before, spoke up. "He's right," the man said, his deep voice cutting through the room. "We need to do better. I've been in this industry for years, and I've seen firsthand how discrimination operates in ways both blatant and subtle. If we're serious about change, we need to put it in writing. Policy revisions, clear accountability structures, and transparency with the public." Emma hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. "Very well. We'll draft a formal proposal for policy changes and bring it to our next board meeting. You'll have our written commitment within the next 2 weeks." It wasn't perfect. It wasn't everything Marcus wanted. But it was a start. He nodded. "I'll hold you to that." Emma offered a tight smile. "I have no doubt you will." As Marcus and Jonathan left the meeting, stepping into the crisp afternoon air, Marcus let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He turned to his father, who was watching him with quiet pride. "You did good, son." Marcus wasn't sure if he had won, but for the first time in days, he felt something close to victory. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about making sure that no one else had to go through what he did. And he wasn't done yet. Marcus sat in the front row of the press conference, his hands gripping the edge of his chair as he watched his father take the stage. Jonathan adjusted the microphone, clearing his throat before he spoke. The room was filled with journalists, activists, and airline executives. Cameras flashed, capturing every moment as the world waited for the official response to Marcus's confrontation with Emma Carter. Jonathan's voice was steady and commanding. "Today marks an important step in acknowledging the injustices that have gone unnoticed for far too long." He paused, scanning the crowd. "As of this moment, Carter Airways is committing to a complete overhaul of its policies regarding discrimination, diversity, and inclusion. We recognize the harm that has been caused, and we are dedicated to making things right." A murmur spread through the audience, some skeptical, others hopeful. Marcus took a deep breath. This was it, the moment he had fought for. Emma Carter stepped forward, her expression solemn but resolute. "We failed," she admitted. "We failed Marcus, and we failed countless others who have faced discrimination while traveling with our airline. And for that, I offer my deepest apology." It wasn't enough, not yet. But Marcus could see that this was different from the rehearsed corporate responses he had seen before. There was weight to her words. She continued, "Effective immediately, Carter Airways will be implementing new anti-discrimination training for all employees, increasing diversity within our leadership, and establishing an independent oversight committee to address complaints and ensure accountability. This is not just a PR move. This is the beginning of real change." The room erupted into a flurry of questions, journalists eager to dissect the implications. Marcus, however, wasn't focused on them. His mind was on the people who had reached out to him, strangers who had shared their own stories of mistreatment, of feeling powerless. It wasn't just about him. It never had been. After the press conference, a group of reporters approached Marcus, asking for his reaction. He hesitated for a moment, then spoke from the heart. "This isn't about me getting justice. This is about making sure no one else has to go through what I did. I appreciate the airline taking these steps, but real change doesn't happen overnight. We have to hold them accountable and keep pushing forward." His words were met with nods of agreement, and as the cameras turned off, people came up to shake his hand, some thanking him, others sharing their own painful experiences. An older woman clasped his hand tightly. "You remind me of my grandson," she said, eyes brimming with tears. "He went through something similar years ago, but no one listened back then. Thank you for speaking up. Marcus felt a lump form in his throat. He had spent so much time feeling like he was drowning in the weight of this fight, but now he realized he wasn't alone. As he stepped away from the crowd, his father caught up with him, placing a hand on his shoulder. You did this, Jonathan said softly. Your voice made a difference. Marcus swallowed hard, looking up at his father. It's not just my voice. It's all of ours. And this is just the beginning. Later that evening, as he scrolled through social media, he saw the impact of his fight spreading far beyond the press conference. People were sharing their own stories, calling for broader changes in the airline industry. The hashtag #FlyFair was trending, with thousands demanding more than just apologies from corporations. They wanted action. A notification popped up, an invitation to speak at a national diversity summit. Marcus hesitated. A few weeks ago, he would have rejected it outright. But now, he saw what his voice could do. He took a deep breath and typed a response. I'd be honored. As he hit send, a sense of purpose settled over him. The world wasn't perfect. It was still unfair, still filled with challenges. But today, he had proven that standing up and speaking out could create real change. And that was worth everything. Marcus sat on the balcony of his apartment, gazing at the city lights flickering in the distance. The cool evening breeze carried the faint sounds of traffic and distant laughter, yet inside his heart, a quiet storm raged. It had been days since the press conference, and while the world had moved forward, Marcus felt like he was standing still, trapped in the aftermath of everything that had transpired. His phone vibrated on the small table beside him, another notification lighting up the screen. He glanced at it but didn't reach for it. Over the past week, messages had flooded in from strangers across the country, some offering support, others sharing their own painful experiences. It was overwhelming, humbling, and yet, he felt like an imposter. He wasn't an activist. He hadn't planned for any of this. And yet, here he was, the face of a movement he had never intended to lead. He sighed, rubbing his temples. What now? He muttered under his breath. A soft knock at the balcony door pulled him from his thoughts. His father, Jonathan, stepped out, holding 2 steaming cups of tea. Figured you could use this. Marcus gave a small smile as he accepted the cup. Thanks, Dad. Jonathan sat down beside him, cradling his own mug. You've been quiet lately. Marcus exhaled slowly. Just thinking. A lot. About everything. Jonathan nodded. I get it. What you did, speaking out the way you did, it wasn't easy. And now, the weight of it is settling in. Marcus took a sip of his tea, the warmth spreading through him. I didn't ask for any of this. I just wanted to stand up for myself. Now people are looking to me like I have all the answers. Like I can fix something that's been broken for a long time. Jonathan studied his son carefully. You may not have asked for it, but you rose to the challenge. You made people listen. That's not something just anyone can do. Marcus let out a short laugh. But what if I don't know what to say next? What if I mess up? Jonathan placed a firm hand on his son's shoulder. Then you learn. You grow. You don't have to have all the answers, Marcus. But you do have something powerful, your voice. And as long as you use it with honesty and purpose, you're already making a difference. Marcus looked down at his mug, his reflection rippling in the dark liquid. Maybe his father was right. Maybe he didn't need to have it all figured out right away. But he couldn't ignore the pull in his chest, the feeling that this fight wasn't over, not for him, not for the countless others who had reached out to him. He hesitated before speaking. I got an invitation to speak at a national diversity summit next month. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. That's a big deal. Yeah, Marcus murmured. I haven't responded yet. Jonathan tilted his head slightly. Why not? Marcus shrugged. Because, what if I'm not ready? What if I say the wrong thing? Jonathan smiled, his eyes warm with understanding. Son, no one is ever truly ready for moments like this. But the fact that you care enough to worry about getting it right? That means you're already on the right path. Marcus let his father's words sink in. He had spent so much time questioning himself, wondering if he was the right person to take this fight forward. But maybe his doubts weren't a sign of weakness, maybe they were a sign that he was doing something that mattered. He took a deep breath and pulled out his phone. He opened the email invitation, his finger hovering over the reply button. A moment of hesitation passed before he typed his response. "I'd be honored." As he hit send, a weight lifted off his shoulders. He didn't know exactly what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to sit on the sidelines anymore. He had a voice, and he was going to use it. Jonathan clinked his mug against Marcus's in a silent toast. To new beginnings. Marcus smiled. To making a difference. As the city lights twinkled around them, Marcus felt something shift inside him. The boy who had been kicked out of first class was gone. In his place stood a young man who had found his purpose, and he was just getting started. Marcus stood in the kitchen, absent-mindedly stirring a pot of pasta while his thoughts wandered. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of emotions, events, and newfound responsibilities. The summit invitation had solidified his role as a public figure in a way he had never anticipated. He had accepted it, and now there was no turning back. But in the midst of it all, something felt incomplete. He hadn't really had a moment to just be with his father, to talk about everything without cameras, reporters, or the pressure of social media. Tonight, he had invited Jonathan over for dinner, just the two of them. No media, no business talk, just family. The doorbell rang, and Marcus wiped his hands on a towel before heading to open it. Jonathan stood there, a bottle of wine in hand, a warm smile on his face. "Hope this pairs well with whatever you're cooking." Marcus chuckled and stepped aside to let his father in. "If not, we'll just drink it anyway." Jonathan laughed as he set the bottle on the counter and took in the cozy atmosphere of Marcus's apartment. "It's been a while since we had a night like this." Marcus nodded. "Yeah. I figured we could use it. Just us. No interviews, no speeches, no expectations." Jonathan sat at the dining table, watching his son move around the kitchen with practiced ease. "You've been handling everything so well, Marcus. I know it hasn't been easy." Marcus set 2 plates on the table, letting out a deep sigh. "It's been a lot. Some days, I feel like I'm doing the right thing. Other days, I feel like I'm in way over my head." Jonathan poured them each a glass of wine. "That's normal. Every great leader feels that way at some point. The important thing is that you don't let the fear stop you." Marcus sat across from his father, twirling his fork through his pasta. "I just keep thinking about how it all started. I was just trying to stand up for myself, for what was right. And now, I feel like I have this huge responsibility." Jonathan nodded. "You do. But responsibility isn't a burden, it's an opportunity. You have the chance to make real change, Marcus. To be a voice for people who haven't been heard. And you're not doing it alone." Marcus looked up, meeting his father's eyes. "I know. And I'm grateful for that. More than you know." Jonathan reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand over his son's. "I'm proud of you, Marcus. Not just for what you're doing, but for who you are. For how you've handled everything with integrity and strength." A lump formed in Marcus's throat, and he swallowed hard. "I couldn't have done it without you, Dad. You've always been my role model, even when I didn't realize it." Jonathan smiled, his eyes glistening. "And you, son, have surpassed every expectation I ever had. You are becoming the man I always knew you could be." The two sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of their words settling between them. It was a moment of understanding, of recognition, of love. Marcus took a deep breath. No matter what happens next, I want you to know I'm going to keep fighting. For people like me, for those who don't have a voice. I want to use whatever platform I have to make things better. Jonathan raised his glass. Then here's to that. To standing together, to making a difference, and to always staying true to who we are. Marcus clinked his glass against his father's, a renewed sense of purpose settling in his chest. He wasn't alone in this fight. He never had been. As they finished their meal, laughter and stories filling the room, Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in weeks: peace. He didn't have all the answers, and he still had doubts. But for the first time in a long time, he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. Marcus stood at the podium, his hands resting lightly on the surface, his heart pounding in his chest. The lights in the conference hall were bright, casting a glow over the faces of the hundreds of attendees gathered before him. Journalists, activists, corporate leaders, and everyday citizens had all come to hear him speak. Just a few months ago, he had been just another passenger on a flight. Now, he was here, addressing a crowd that wanted to hear his voice. He took a steadying breath and glanced at his father, sitting in the front row. Jonathan gave him an encouraging nod. That simple gesture sent a wave of calm through him. He had prepared for this moment, and now it was time to step into it. A few months ago, I was just a kid trying to get to my destination, Marcus began, his voice steady. I never expected to be here, standing in front of all of you, speaking about something that has affected so many people for so long. But life has a funny way of leading us to where we need to be. The audience listened intently as Marcus recounted his journey, the injustice he faced, the pain of being silenced, and the realization that he had a platform to make a difference. He spoke about the changes the airline had promised and the ongoing need for accountability. Change isn't just about policies, he continued, his voice growing stronger. It's about people. It's about the way we treat one another, the way we choose to stand up when we see something wrong. It's about making sure that no one ever feels less than because of the color of their skin, their background, or their circumstances. A wave of applause rippled through the room. Marcus felt a rush of emotion, but he kept going. I don't stand here today as an expert or a leader who has all the answers. I stand here as someone who decided not to stay silent. And that's something all of us can do. Each of us has a voice, and when we use it together, we create something powerful. We create change. Jonathan watched his son with pride, his heart full. He had always known Marcus was special, but seeing him in this moment, standing tall and fearless, was something beyond what he had imagined. Marcus had found his purpose, and he was embracing it fully. As Marcus wrapped up his speech, he took a deep breath. This isn't the end of the journey, it's just the beginning. I'm going to keep fighting, keep advocating, and keep working to make things better. And I hope all of you will, too. Because together, we can make sure that no one else has to go through what I did. Together, we can make real, lasting change. The room erupted into a standing ovation. Marcus felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, but he held his head high. This moment wasn't just about him, it was about everyone who had ever been made to feel invisible. And today, they were seen. As he stepped down from the podium, Jonathan pulled him into a tight embrace. You did good, son. You did real good. Marcus smiled, letting the warmth of the moment sink in. This was just the beginning, and he was ready for whatever came next. Life had thrown him into the spotlight, but he had chosen what to do with it. And now, with his father by his side and a fire in his heart, he was ready to make a difference. As they walked out together, the city lights shining in the distance, Marcus knew one thing for sure, this was his new beginning. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?